So every day, my newsletter pipeline automatically generates a podcast episode to go along with the text. No editing, no recording. It's fully autonomous. Here's what this sounds like.
The market gets serious, but the tools to manage those assets lag behind.
Lag behind? Charles, they're in the Stone Age. Collectors are sitting on thousands, sometimes millions of dollars in value and managing it with spreadsheets and shoeboxes. There's no liquidity, no easy way to get a real-time valuation.
Which brings us to the opportunity.
Imagine a platform, let's call it Verus.
All right, that's enough. So that's two AI hosts with distinct personalities having a real conversation about today's startup idea. One thing I didn't expect is how describing things that nobody can see, such as their personalities or even the setting, like whether they're sitting in a dusty studio or a coffee shop, can meaningfully change how the resulting audio sounds. I'll show you exactly how that works. Hi, I'm Mirko. I run GammaVibe, a daily newsletter where an AI pipeline researches the news and generates startup ideas, including these audio overviews. If you want to build something like this yourself, I put together a free blueprint that breaks down the full architecture and even provides some Claude code prompts to get you started. The link's in the description. But today, let's focus on the audio piece. We'll go over how to pick the right voices and set the scene. We'll generate a podcast script, and finally, we'll generate the actual audio. All right, so we'll assume that we have some sort of content that we want to turn into a podcast. In my case, this is the daily newsletter written in markdown. But this could also be a blog post that you've written, a published news article, a video transcript, and so on. There are two steps to creating a podcast. First, we need to create a script. And then we generate the actual audio from the script. So let's look at what a script might look like. Here's my admin interface that I'm using for GammaVibe. It's kind of a convenient way to inspect all the data in my database, all the daily ideas, and the various outputs from each of the pipeline steps. So here's the script. You see that it's pretty straightforward, right? We just see Ada and some text, Charles and some text, and so on. They basically just alternate. So this looks pretty similar to a theater script or something that you might hand a voice actor. Now, before we can generate the actual podcast, we need to think a little bit about the hosts and the setting. So who are these two hosts? In my case, who are Ada and Charles? We have their names, but what are their personalities? What do they speak like? What are their mannerisms? And maybe even what's the setting? Like, are they sitting in a meeting room or an office or at a cafe? Are they meeting in person or online? Now, you might ask, why do we need this? I mean, this is about audio. Why do we need all this stuff that nobody can see? But it's actually quite important for influencing the audio itself. Having clear personalities and a setting will make the resulting audio much more authentic and vibrant. Otherwise, it will tend to be more of a flat performance. This might not be super noticeable on an individual podcast basis, but if you pay attention over time, it really is the difference between a really engaging podcast that sounds real and, an AI-generated audio overview. So let's look at the prompt that I'm using in my implementation. Here we see my podcast script step, one of the many steps in my pipeline. A lot of this is boilerplate, so we don't really care about it right now. The important thing is here in the system prompt that we're creating. So it starts out with, you are a podcast scriptwriter for GammaVibe Daily. Now here we have a placeholder variable. For me, this is 4 minutes. So you can kind of easily change the duration of the podcast. So a 4-minute podcast episode that accompanies each newsletter. Then below we have director's notes. So this is where we specify the two host profiles. So first we define Ada. We specify the voice here as well. So this maps to one of the voices that the Gemini text-to-speech model supports. Technically, I don't really need this here because we're just generating the script. So This is kind of superfluous, but it doesn't hurt. More importantly, we define Ada's role. So her role is the energetic, forward-thinking developer, and her personality is the optimistic technologist who loves building things. Then we define her speech style, right? So she speaks in quick bursts. She uses metaphors. She speaks in possibilities. Some signature phrases that she uses, things like imagine if, the potential is, or what if we could, and mannerisms. So she gets excited about the technical details. She draws connections to future trends. And her focus is on how to build it. What's technically interesting? What's the opportunity? I feel like this is already kind of coming to life, right? It's not just some random name and a voice, but there's an actual artificial, but still an actual personality behind it. And then similar with Charles, his role is the pragmatic, slightly skeptical investor. His personality is the grounded realist. He focuses on viability. His speech style is complete, measured sentences, and he asks probing questions. Signature phrases include, let's look at the numbers, but how does it scale? And in terms of mannerisms, he likes to play devil's advocate. He grounds Ada's enthusiasm with market reality. He focuses on costs, risks, competition, and defensibility. So you can already see that there should be some interesting tension emerging here, right? So both in the script itself that we're generating right now, but this will also be reflected in the actual audio later. So it's important for both steps. Next, we briefly define the script format. This is probably unnecessary. I think without this, it would likely do more or less the same thing, but it doesn't hurt to make it very clear that we want, speaker name, dialogue, speaker name, dialogue. The episode structure is a lot more important though. If we look back at the actual newsletter post, right? So here we have the title, then below we have the signal, the problem, the solution. So this is kind of the high-level opportunity. Then we talk about the business case, including the revenue model and the go-to-market strategy. We talk about the moat, why now, and then finally the builder's corner, so the suggested tech stack. And this suggests a particular structure for an engaging podcast episode, which we define here. So the podcast has an intro where Ada welcomes us. There's a brief hook about the topic. Then they talk about what specifically is happening in the news that makes this relevant. There's some back and forth to establish context. Ada enthusiastically explains the business idea. Charles asks clarifying questions, pushes back. There's a reality check where Charles raises some concerns about competition, costs, and scaling. And then Ada addresses these, or maybe just acknowledges valid points. And then a brief takeaway where they wrap things up with an actionable insight. And then last not least, we define some rules. We say that it must sound like a real conversation, not just a script reading. This means including natural reactions, things like, right, interesting, and so on. Ada should occasionally interrupt with excitement. Charles should express skepticism but remain respectful. They should reference specific details from the newsletter, like company names or tech. Keep it under a certain number of minutes or words. End with a memorable one-liner. Now, this is really important here. No production cues. This is actually here as a result of a bug that I encountered early on. So at some point, the generated script included something like intro music fades, probably something that it saw in other scripts that were meant to be used for like a manual production. However, in this case, if I just feed this to the text-to-speech model, it'll just literally read that out because there is no way to, fade out the non-existent intro music. So that generated some funny but annoying artifacts in the audio. So to avoid that, I very specifically tell it to never include music or sound effect directions. And with LLMs, whenever you provide instructions like that, it always helps to explicitly explain why this is important, right? So I tell it, there is no post-production. The text-to-speech model generates the final audio directly. So since I added this, I haven't had any more problems with this. Similarly, this is in response to another problem I encountered, right? So my newsletter generates startup ideas, including a fictitious startup name. Now, at some point, it generated a script and then a resulting audio where they talked about it as if it was a real startup out there. So I had to make it very clear that this is just a concept. It's just an idea for a startup, and that they should use language like you could build or imagine a product that, and so on. So that fixed that particular issue, right? So over time, you might need to do some prompt engineering based on issues that you observe in the wild. Finally, we just reiterate that we want plain text output with speaker labels. We want an estimated duration. This was the system prompt. And then here we have the actual user prompt. That's really straightforward. We just say, create a podcast episode script based on this newsletter. Now we have the subject of the newsletter. We have the preview text and then the full markdown content. And then we just say, generate an engaging 4-minute discussion between Ada and Charles about this business idea. And that's it. The rest of the code is straightforward, right? It's just a plain old LLM call that returns text. So I won't dwell on this more. So now that we have the script, we can generate the actual audio. Before we do that, we need to pick voices for our two hosts. So the best way to do that is to go to Google AI Studio at aistudio.google.com. This is where you manage your API keys. You can actually prototype entire applications here, all kinds of things. It's a really cool tool, definitely worth playing around a little bit. Now we're going to go to the playground. And then in the playground, we're going to select text-to-speech. You'll see that we're given two different models as options. They're both Gemini 2.5. One is the Pro model and one is Flash. Pro costs twice as much. It's about 3 cents per minute of generated audio. So Flash is about 1.5 cents. So they're both pretty affordable, and I want the best possible quality here. So we're going to go with the Pro model. Okay, let's close this sidebar here so we have a little bit more space. You see that by default, it has an example script in here that's very short and simple. 2 speakers, each has 1 line of text, and then some voices on the right. So this way you can easily test things out. Let's maybe audition some of these voices. So let's try maybe core. Core is described as firm with a middle pitch.
Ready to make something amazing?
And then how about algebra, smooth with a lower pitch?
Ready to make something amazing?
Maybe one more. Algenib, who's gravelly with a lower pitch.
What's a skill you'd like to develop?
And what about Pulcherima?
Ready to make something amazing?
All right, I won't spend more time on it. It's kind of fun to go through these. I should also mention that you can see a list of the voices if you go to the Gemini API docs and then click on text-to-speech and then on the voice options here. They don't have a lot of details, but it's better than nothing. They also list supported languages and things like that. Anyway, I would encourage you to listen to some of the voices and pick voices that match the hosts and the personalities that you envision. And again, they will sound somewhat flat when you listen to them here. So do keep in mind that the prompt that we're going to provide is actually going to influence them meaningfully. You might imagine some of these voices speaking fast or slow or, excitedly or measured. There's a lot of different dimensions. You can even give them accents. You could specify that one of them speaks with a southern drawl or maybe with a British accent. So now I entered the names for the 2 speakers, Ada and Charles, and I selected the voices that I use in my actual implementation. So I use Kelly Rowe for Ada and Oris for Charles. And then I've also pasted in the actual script for this particular episode. Note that I did not add any sort of preamble here that defines the personalities of these speakers, the setting and things like that. So I want to See if you'll notice the difference if we generate it once without that. You'll see that it actually nicely exploded all of that here in the middle. By the way, you'll see that the prompt that we used earlier to generate the script definitely influenced the generated text here, right? So Ada says things like, exactly. There's a lot of exclamations in there. The scale is staggering. That is a massive validated market. Whereas Charles is more like, it makes sense, Or here we have lag behind. Charles, they're in the Stone Age, right? So there's clearly a lot of energy and excitement in the way she speaks, even before you can listen to the generated audio. All right, I'm going to click on this. One thing I should point out, you can probably generate a few short things with the free plan, but realistically, you're going to be subject to a pretty low quota. So I'm actually going to put in my API key here, my paid API key. All right, now my key is in there, and now I'll be able to generate as much as I want. I'll click on Run. This will actually take a few minutes, but don't worry, you won't notice that in the video. All right, that took about 3 minutes or so. It'll take the same amount of time when you do this through the API later as well. So definitely worth noting that generating audio does take a little bit of time. Let's click on play here.
Welcome to GammaVibe Daily, the show where we break down the business ideas hidden in today's headlines.
And today, we're talking about your dusty old action figures and why they might be an emerging asset class.
So it sounds great. I do immediately notice, since I've spent some time with these two virtual people, that Ada speaks quite a bit more measured and slow now. I wonder if I can find this part of the audio, because this, I think, is where her excitement was particularly noticeable in the original audio. So let me see if I can find this.
Spending it on collectibles.
It makes sense. We've seen this playbook with other alternative assets like art, wine, and watches. The market gets serious, but the tools to manage those assets lag way behind.
Lag behind? Charles, they're in the Stone Age. Collectors are sitting on thousands, sometimes millions of dollars in value, and managing it with spreadsheets and shoeboxes.
All right, that's good enough. So the audio is actually already quite good without any sort of system prompt. It's a little nuanced, hard to maybe notice the details. Let me try it now, though, with the enhanced prompts. Let's switch back to the code for a moment. So we looked at the podcast script step earlier, and here is my podcast audio step, right? So the important thing that we define here is this text-to-speech preamble. Here we define, again, an audio profile for each of the hosts. Ada is the energetic, forward-thinking developer, the scene. So we describe, I think it really helps to sort of visualize it, right? So Ada sits in her home office on a bright morning, a steaming cup of coffee beside her keyboard. Her monitors glow with code and news feeds. She's genuinely excited to share today's discovery. The vibe is casual, curious, and optimistic, like catching up with a brilliant friend. And then we have some director's notes, very similar to what we had earlier in the other prompt, right? About her enthusiastic and curious style, like sharing a cool discovery with a friend, warm and inviting. Her pacing is energetic with natural variation. She speeds up when excited about an idea, slows down for emphasis on key points. Her accent, American English, casual tech professional. And then similarly for Charles, he's the pragmatic, slightly skeptical investor. And we're putting Charles in a corner office of a VC firm with a city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chair and neat desk, thoughtful expression. He's seen hundreds of pitches and knows which questions separate the dreamers from the builders. Also similar director's notes here, measured and analytical, occasional dry wit, asks probing questions, skeptical but fair, genuinely wants ideas to succeed if they're sound. Deliberate with thoughtful pauses, never rushed, lets points land before responding. Also speaks with American English, slightly more formal and professional. And then podcast transcript. This is where we append the actual script that we generated. So what I'm going to do is just copy all of this, and then we'll paste it in here as a preamble. So now we have pretty much exactly what my production pipeline uses to generate the audio. We have the full preamble in here, followed by the actual podcast transcript. So I'm going to generate this one more time. All right, so here we have the updated audio. I'll play just a few seconds, see if you can spot the difference.
Spending it on collectibles.
It makes sense. We've seen this playbook with other alternative assets like art, wine, and watches. The market gets serious, but the tools to manage those assets lag behind.
Lag behind? Charles, they're in the Stone Age. Collectors are sitting on thousands, sometimes millions of dollars.
All right, that's enough. So yeah, the differences might be subtle, but if you spend some time listening to the full generated results, I promise you'll notice enough of a difference to make it worthwhile to really tune things, tune the personalities, tune the setting, and so on. Let's briefly look at the code for generating these. It's actually pretty straightforward. One option is actually simply to click on Get Code up here. This is quite nice. AI Studio, by default, I'm getting the Python code here, which is what I'm using. This is actually very similar to the code in my own app, right? Here they have actually the full script. It actually put all of that in here, so that's quite nice. So you could literally just take this, save it locally, put in your API key and run it. Down below, we see how it defines the two speaker profiles or speaker voice config, as it calls them here. Ada, voice Caliro, and Charles and voice Gross. Then it processes the generated output, all the binary chunks here, saves it as a WAV file, and that's basically it. There is a bunch of boilerplate because dealing with audio data is a little bit more involved than just plain text. And if you prefer TypeScript or some other language, it's just as straightforward. My own code is very similar. So here I have a function that actually calls the Gemini API and passes in the script. One thing I'm doing here is converting the WAV file to MP3. And I'm simply shelling out to the FFmpeg command line tool to do that. There are other ways to do this, but this was nice and straightforward. But no rocket science here. And honestly, if you use Cloud Code or other tools, they all know how to write this. And again, I also recommend looking at the official docs. They're quite good. They cover both the single speaker and multi-speaker cases. This is the multi-speaker code. Again, very similar to what we just looked at. They talk about how to control the speech style with prompts, right? So you can do things like say in a spooky whisper or whatever. So of course you would have to first get these kinds of prompts into the script so that the audio model can actually pick it up from there. But yeah, go through the docs. They're quite solid. So now that you have the generated audio, where do you go from here, right? So you can easily publish this as an actual podcast. That's beyond the scope of this video, but you can either look into podcast services that have APIs, or you could even simply push the audio files to cloud storage like Amazon S3 and create your own RSS feed without using a full-blown podcast service. Of course, you could also embed the audio in a newsletter like the one that I'm generating for GammaVibe and hosting on Ghost, which makes that quite easy as well. You could even extend this to support video. I'll actually go over that in a future video. All right, that's all I wanted to cover here in this video. So hopefully this was helpful. Again, if you would like to build a similar pipeline, go take a look at the blueprint in the description. I'm also creating a course about how to do this. That's going to be a little bit more detailed. So downloading the blueprint will also add you to the waitlist for the course, so I can share when that's ready. Thanks for watching. Likes and subscribes are appreciated as well, and see you next time.